Urenna and the Sleeping Prince. Once upon a time, in a village far away, lived a pretty girl called Urenna. Urenna was adopted by Bulma when she was a little girl, but Bulma treated her like a house help instead of a daughter. Bulma had two daughters, Kanwuli and Kambili. Kanwuli and Kambili treated Urenna like a slave. They made her do all the house chores while they sat around doing nothing. One day, the town crier went around the village to announce that the great prince has just returned from the battlefield. The handsome prince of their village was a fierce warrior, and he led the army to victory against another powerful village far away. Everyone was excited to see the prince return. Bulma and her daughters were not left behind. They too were excited to welcome the prince back to the village. On the day of the prince's arrival, the entire village was in celebration. People lined the streets with excitement to see the prince return. Urenna too wanted to go and watch the prince's arrival, but Bulma banished her back into the house and gave her a long list of chores to do before they got back. Sad, Urenna faced her chores. Maybe some other time she would see the strong, brave prince. Kambili and Kanwuli thought the prince was so handsome, and they fantasized about the idea of being his wife one day. Many days after, the palace was thrown into turmoil. The king was beside himself with worry. The warrior prince has fallen into a deep sleep upon his arrival from the war front. All efforts to wake the prince failed, even though he was still alive. The king, in haste, sent for the chief priest, who consulted the gods. The gods told him that the prince had been pierced by a magical arrow while he was on the war front, and can only be woken by one with the chosen voice. The king was perplexed. Who would have the chosen voice, and how would they know? The chief priest told him that the gods said the person with the chosen voice that can wake the prince is right there in their village. The king swung into action. He sent for his town crier and told him to go around the village and tell anyone who wakes the prince from his deep slumber will be heavily rewarded with gold and land and riches beyond their wildest imagination. The town crier hastily went into town and spread the message. That morning in Bulma's home, she was relaxing with her daughters in their living room. Urenna wanted to join in, but Bulma sent her off to the stream to go and fetch some water. On Urenna's way to the stream, she saw the town crier and heard the message that he had from the palace. She was so sad to hear that the prince had fallen into a deep slumber. She had heard of how handsome the prince was from Kanwuli and Kambili on the day he arrived into the village, and she felt bad that such a brave young man would fall into such a predicament. She hoped somebody could help him. She rushed back home to tell Bulma what she had heard. Bulma gathered up her daughters and told them to start practicing their voices, as one of them must wake the prince from slumber and gain all the riches promised by the king. Urenna begged that she also go with them to the palace. She also wanted to give it a try. She genuinely wanted to help the prince and would even do it for no riches or reward at all. Bulma dismissed her, saying that a girl like her had no place in the palace, and she warned her that if she did not return with the water that she was meant to fetch, she would be in serious trouble. Urenna ran to the stream and fetched the water. While she was there, all she could think about was the poor prince in a deep slumber, and hoped that somebody could wake him up. Urenna spoke while she was at the river. Maybe her voice could wake the prince, but the more she listened to her voice, the more dismayed she got. There was nothing special about how she sounded. Well, she hoped that somebody else would be able to save the prince, if not her. That morning, Bulma and her daughters fantasized about the reward they would bring back from the palace once their beautiful voices waked the prince. Bulma told them that they are short-sighted, as apart from receiving the reward from the king, they needed to think about which one of them could marry the prince. Such a powerful, handsome prince belonged in a family like Bulma's, and she wanted nothing more than for her daughters to marry the prince. And more wealth and riches would come their way, and she would be known as the mother of the queen. They were all excited just at the thought. Then Urenna came in and begged to go with them. Even if she couldn't help wake the prince, she just wanted to accompany her family. This angered Bulma. How dare she bring up such a silly suggestion when they were on their way to change their lives? She warned Urenna that those chores better be done by the time they get back from successfully waking the prince and collecting all the reward. And once they do, she would deal with Urenna accordingly. When Bulma and her daughters reached the palace, there was already a long line of young women waiting their turn to try and wake the prince. Bulma was angry. Urenna was the cause of this delay with her silly suggestion and foolish advice. She would deal with her later. Finally, the turn of Kanwuli and Kambili came. Kanwuli went in first. She spoke softly to him and spoke harshly to him. She tried everything, but the prince simply did not wake. Kambili went in next. She also tried to wake the prince. She even sang and tried her hardest to whisper in his ear to wake up, but the prince did not wake up. The palace guards escorted them out of the palace as they had failed, and the reward would not be coming to them. Bulma scolded her daughters. Maybe they didn't do it right, she said. How can two of her beautiful daughters not be able to do a simple task like waking the prince from his deep slumber? That night, Bulma could hardly sleep. She spent the night outside thinking of how to make sure this reward landed in her family. And not just that, to make sure that one of her daughters married the prince. She had dreams of becoming the mother of the future queen, and all the respect that came with it. She would let nothing stand in her way. The next day, she and her daughters went to a powerful sorcerer's shrine. She told the sorcerer her predicament and how she wanted one of her daughters, or even both of them, to have the power to awaken the prince from his slumber. The sorcerer gave them a charm and asked them to put it underneath their pillow and go to sleep. However, no other hand must touch the charm apart from those of her daughters. Bulma thanked the sorcerer, and they rushed home with excitement. When Bulma returned, she found Urenna relaxing outside. She sent her into the house to do all the chores and clean all the rooms. When Urenna reached Kambili and Kanwuli's room, she laid the bed and saw the charm. She quickly put it back where she found it and left the room. The next day, Bulma and her daughters were excited to head back to the palace. As they got to the palace, the guard asked them if they had already tried once before. Bulma lied that she and her daughters had never come to try to wake the prince, and this was their first time. Excitedly, the girls went in. Kambili tried. Kanwuli tried as well. Once again, they were met with defeat. The prince did not wake up at the sound of their voice. The king's guard warned them that this was their last chance and never to return, as their voices obviously are unable to wake the prince. Bulma was furious. What happened to the charm the sorcerer promised would work? She stormed the sorcerer's shrine and asked him why the charm did not work. The sorcerer asked them once again if anybody else touched the charm apart from them. Bulma said no. They put it right under the pillow as he had suggested and went to the palace the very next day. The sorcerer told them to check very well, as the gods are never wrong. She kept thinking what could have happened. Kanwuli suspected that Urenna may have touched the charm, but Bulma said she dare not do that. While they headed home in anger, Urenna was at Bulma's farm doing her work. After she was done for the day, she decided to try another route home. As she walked along, she took the path behind the king's palace, and she sang to herself as she walked home. As she sang, she was oblivious to the fact that the prince was starting to wake up. The palace guard, the king, and the king's court were in shock. The The prince was rousing from his deep slumber, yet no one's voice was waking him up. How was this possible? The prince woke up hale and hearty, and the king was so excited. He sent his town crier to share the good news with the villagers and invite everybody to the palace for a banquet in honor of his son. When Bulma got home, she called for Urenna and asked her if she went into her daughter's room. Urenna said she only went in there to clean as usual. Bulma began to beat her. Urenna cried out in pain, but Bulma was interrupted by the town crier who came to deliver the good news that the prince had woken up. Bulma eyed Urenna and asked her if she went to the palace at all. Urenna cried and said she didn't, as she had no business at the palace. Bulma had warned her never to go near the palace anyway, and she would not dare disobey her. Bulma was curious. How did the prince then wake up? She and her daughters were going to go to the palace anyway to celebrate at the banquet. Hopefully the prince's eye would catch one of them. Urenna once again asked if she could accompany them to the palace for the banquet. Urenna told her to banish the thoughts and stay home and do her chores. At the banquet, the prince kept looking around, hoping to hear the voice that woke him up in the crowd. But he never did. The king saw that his son was sad and asked him what the problem was. Was he not happy to be awake from the deep, mysterious slumber? The prince said that he had not been at rest, as he wanted to meet the person whose voice woke him up. The king decreed that whoever it is that was able to wake his son up from slumber should come forward and receive a huge reward. All the maidens claimed that they were the one, but the prince said no. None of their voices sounded like what he heard in his deep slumber. They summoned the chief priest, as the prince was adamant that he was going to find the person whose voice woke him up. The chief priest consulted the gods once again. The gods revealed that the person with the enchanted voice that woke the prince was right there in their village, but she never set foot in the palace. The prince and his soldiers walked through the village. He kept his ears open intently for any voice that would resonate with him. He became obsessed with finding the person with the enchanted voice. When Bulma heard that the prince was walking around the village looking for the person with the enchanted voice, she made her daughters drink hot water and honey to make their voices soft and enchanting. She made them practice speaking in an enchanting manner so that the prince could hear them and choose them as the one with the enchanted voice. She quickly sent Urenna on an errand to get her out of the way while the prince came by their hut. On the way around the village, the prince walked past the farm where Urenna was talking to herself and laughing and singing. He stopped and looked around. Whose voice was that, he thought. He called out for the owner of the voice. But Urenna was scared. She quickly packed the crops and ran home. The king's soldiers trailed her back to Bulma's hut. The next day, the prince and his guards came to Bulma's hut. He told her that the person with the enchanted voice was right inside her hut. Bulma was excited and she said yes, that the person with the enchanted voice indeed was living in her hut. She brought out her two daughters and paraded them before the prince. The prince heard their voices but was not convinced. He asked Bulma if there was anybody else in the house. Bulma said no, that only her and her daughters lived there. The prince and his guards left, but he told one of them to hide behind the bushes and watch out for anybody else that goes in and out of the hut. As soon as the prince left, Bulma sent for Urenna. She was furious with her and asked her if she went anywhere near the palace or spoke to the prince. Urenna innocently begged and said no. She had no business being around royalty, just like Bulma had told her. From that day, Bulma forbade her from leaving the hut for any reason. She must never be seen going in or going out of the hut. Urenna was sad. Why would Bulma tell her never to leave the hut? How would she fetch water for the house? How would she walk on the farmland if she could not leave home? But Bulma did not care. She told her that Kambili and Kanwuli would do the chores while she stayed inside the house. Kambili and Kanwuli protested, but their mother told them to be quiet. Bulma could not come to terms with the fact that Urenna might be the one with the enchanted voice and therefore claim all the reward that the king had promised, and even worse, find favor in the eye of the charming prince. Urenna stayed in the kitchen and did her chores with tears in her eyes. She felt bad that she was now a prisoner inside the house. As she went about her chores inside the house, the soldier heard her singing voice and rushed back to the palace to tell the prince. The prince came out of the palace in disguise and hid in the bushes behind Bulma's hut. They waited and waited for the voice that the soldier said he had heard. Just as he was about to give up, Urenna's voice came filtering through the bushes. The prince was awestruck. That was the voice that woke him up from his slumber. Excited, he rushed back to the palace to remove his disguise. Kambili and Kanwili were outside. They heard rustling in the bushes and saw two strange-looking men running away from the back of their hut. They went in to tell their mother. All Bulma's plans were too late, as shortly after that, the prince emerged with his army. They demanded that Bulma assemble everyone who lived in the house. Without a choice, she brought out Urenna. The prince commanded her to speak, but Urenna shook her head in fear and looked at Bulma. The prince told Bulma that if Urenna did not speak before he left the hut, all of them would be taken prisoner. Afraid, Bulma finally gave Urenna the permission to speak, and as she said her first words, the prince was enamored. He fell in love with Urenna's voice and took her back to the palace. He took her to the king and said that she was the one whose voice woke him up from the slumber, even though she never set foot in the palace. Urenna told the prince that one day, while coming back from the farm, she walked past the back of the palace and was singing as she did so. Maybe her voice reached him from outside. The prince was too excited. He was happy to see such a humble and beautiful young woman whose voice had woken him up from the mysterious sleep. The king gave Urenna all the reward he had promised. Bulma and her two daughters also rushed to the palace and claimed that Urenna was their daughter and sister and that they had been taking such good care of her. Bulma said she was afraid that maybe the king wanted to harm her daughter, and that is why she told her to hide. Bulma begged that Urenna return to the hut with all the reward so that they could continue to live as a happy family. But the prince insisted that from that day, Urenna would never live in the hut with Bulma and her daughters again. She was now part of the royal household. Days passed, and the prince and Urenna became closer and closer. They walked around the village, they talked, and they got to know each other better. The prince asked if Urenna would like to marry him. Urenna was happy. Finally, she would have a family that cared for her genuinely. She said yes, and the king threw a huge party in their honor. Bulma was distraught. She would never get to be the mother of the queen as she imagined. Bulma and her daughters were grief-stricken. They cried and cried in dismay and misery as they watched Urenna claim everything they ever wanted, the reward and the charming prince. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. It helps us. See you in the next one. Bye.